Have you ever stopped to think about what NFL draft analysts have to say and what they think about Zach Harrison? Do you wonder where he might fall in next year's NFL draft? Well, don't you worry. We're going to answer both of those questions in this episode of Locked on Buckeyes.
You are Locked on Buckeyes, your daily podcast on the Ohio State Buckeyes. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, Buckeye fans? Welcome back to another episode of Locked on Buckeyes, part of Locked on Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jay Stevens, also the host of the Jay Stevens Podcast. It is Wednesday, July 20th in the year 2022, and here with us once again, it's Ryan Roberts from Ryzen Draft Scouting. Is also the recruiting guy for Irish Breakdown, the Buckeyes' first opponent of the upcoming season. Ryan is here not wearing the Irish hat, but he wears it all the time. He's wearing a scouting hat as we're talking about 3 defensive linemen that are draft eligible this year. Ryan, welcome back to Locked on Buckeyes.
I appreciate it, Jay. Appreciate it, man. This is probably my favorite position to break down definitely linebackers, but then also defensive linemen are it's where I spend kind of my most time usually in the offseason. So I appreciate you as always for having me back on.
The last time we had Ryan on the show, Ryan used the phrase semi-disappointed to describe the Ohio State offensive line and how they played last year. He talked about their development or lack thereof, talked about how sometimes they were too heavy. And I'm interested to hear what Ryan has to say about the Ohio State defensive line, which to me, Ryan, was extremely underwhelming last year.
It was. The majority, the defense was kind of just underwhelming in general. I think that's why you obviously saw Jim Knowles come in from Oklahoma State this offseason and want to get a little inflection of different terminology and just energy around the program. Because, Ohio State has traditionally been run very well on the defensive side of the football, but the last couple, especially last year, just was not up to par. And for whatever reason, we have seen defensive line specific. We've seen the Bosa brothers. We've seen Chase Young. We've seen a string of even Sam Hubbard's of the world, like a great defensive line play. For whatever reason, last year was not very good, and it was not developed properly because there is a bunch of talent on the defensive line, but they did not play up to what the recruiting rankings said. So they retained, obviously, Larry Johnson, who has gained, he is the best in the business, right? On college football sense, when you're talking about the guys that he's developed over the years. So you had to feel positive about Larry Johnson continuing to develop it, but the truth of the matter is last year just wasn't good enough for Ohio State. So a lot of talent, but it has to eventually become developed talent in order to hit their ceilings. And there are massive ceilings, which makes it exciting, but they need to play a lot better than they did last year, obviously.
It's weird to say that about an Ohio State defensive line, especially when I think in 2020, Haskell Garrett was an All-American. You had some signs of growth, some signs, also some good play, you would think, over the next year, 2, maybe 3. But last year was a step backwards. And I'm not going to say it was all Kerry Coombs or Matt Barnes, the new D coordinator that got promoted during the season. I'm not going to say it was a linebackers or DBs or coaches. I'm not going to put it all on the coaches at all, even on Ryan Day. And I think Ryan Day has failed in some areas with the defense. It's the players to me. I don't care who your coach is. At some point, the players have to play up to at least get better throughout the season. You would hope there would be plays that they would get better. And to me, the most alarming thing was from the players you mentioned, and I understand the Bosas and Chase Young, they're going to get a certain level of attention. But, Ryan, there was no Sam Hubbard last year on this team, and it was really, really a big hole, not just at D-end or D-tackle. There's no guy that's like, hey, I'm not a future first round for the top pick in the NFL draft, but I'm going to be a solid player, above average player at Ohio State, and I'm going to be a guy that NFL teams will want to have and get me. I didn't see that last year. Some people love Zach Harrison, but even he was one that was not really playing up to the expectations people thought that he should be playing up to.
It's a weird blend, Jay, honestly, because last year, Haskell Garrett was a good football player, right? He got the most out of his ability. There's no doubt. But the most talented players who were the older players, like Zach Harrison, did not play up to standard. They just did not develop properly. And then you're also coupling that with the fact that your best defensive linemen last year were probably all freshmen, right? Like that's kind of where, so you're in like this weird in between where it's like your older players did not play up to their full potential, and you just also have a mix of younger players. So you just don't have that meshing of, usually it would be like, wow, I have 1 to 2 guys that are upperclassmen that are dominant football players, and then I have a inflection of youth that is going to kind of fill out the rest of the depth chart. You had that inflection of youth, but you just did not have guys up top as seniors, juniors that showed that they are those NFL caliber players, to your point, right? So I think it was just a really mix of underdeveloped, upperclassmen and then underclassmen. Like that's just kind of what you had. You did not have any consistency from up top, which makes it look less appealing, because I think in a typical year, in my opinion, like if Zach Harrison, for instance, played up to his potential last year and he was a dude, for instance, and then you have JT and Tyleek and all those guys filling in the roles and showing a lot of flashes as a freshman, you feel a lot different about this unit. But I think it's just the underdeveloped upperclassmen that is kind of bringing this one down a little bit.
It's weird to say that. We're going to get to Zach Harrison here in a second and kind of breaking down him as a player and a pro prospect going into the upcoming season. But it's really weird to say that when Larry Johnson is the coach. I am not saying Larry Johnson's a problem. I am not saying that at all. I think we have all seen his track record, not just at Ohio State, but also at Penn State, going back 15, 20 years ago, about the things that he did while coaching. I'm not saying it's him. But at some point, I wonder, and people knock the new age athlete, is there a disconnect between these 18, 19-year-old kids, these athletes, and possibly Larry Johnson being close to 70 years old? Do you think it's the age gap to where like he's teaching things and they're not just picking it up?
I mean, it could be. I don't want to fully speculate, but I actually did just hear a interview that a recruit had this morning where he is a 2024 kid who Ohio State and Notre Dame have kind of separated themselves early with him. And he talked, obviously, Al Washington is the new defensive coordinator. Yes. I mean, defensive line coach at Notre Dame that was at Ohio State over the last few years. And just how they were speaking about the two coaches was very odd, because he was like, I love Larry Johnson, right? Like, I love him. And then it's like, what do you love about him? He's like, it reminds me of my grandfather. And then for a second, you're like, I don't know if I want that 100%, right? Like, I want a guy to kind of come off as a father figure. I want a guy to be respected, obviously. But I mean, everybody that has grandparents, you kind of like, you can get away with some stuff though, right? Like you can go there, you're going to get your dollar, and then you're going to kind of, tear the place apart a little bit. And then they're still going to love you because you're their grandson or granddaughter, right? So it's a little bit of a weird vibe right now, because I think that Larry Johnson's getting to the age now where it's just kind of like, what does the long-term outlook look like, right? Like, well, how long is he going to be there? Is he still have the fire to be that outstanding developer? Because I don't think there's any doubt in the world that Larry Johnson is a great football coach. He has developed so many players, a great resume, but at some point you kind of hit that age where you're just kind of like, but is it going to be the same? Do you have to change a little bit? You have to nuance yourself to do things a little bit differently. That's my question with Larry Johnson, because last year was obviously it was a admiration to a degree, right? Because like that, usually Larry Johnson gets the most out of his defensive lines, but for whatever reason, last year was one of the worst Ohio State defensive lines that we've seen under Larry Johnson, if we're being honest.
It's weird, man. It's a weird thing to think about. It's also weird to think about how NFL teams might view Zach Harrison. Now, I'm not going to say he's a bad player. I'm not going to say he would not start at a Power 5 level if it was outside of Ohio State. Maybe not Alabama, because their defense they have also run a different defense than Ohio State does. I'm not saying he wouldn't start at a high-level Power 5 school. I'm not saying that at all. Like, I'm not trying to knock him as a player. But you said it earlier, and you said it so well. He didn't play up to the standard that has been set at Ohio State, and the standard that he knows he should be playing up to as you watch him play football. Could you elaborate more in describing him not playing up to said standard that the Buckeyes have set?
Well, I mean, I think it's twofold. One, Ohio State, and we went through all the names, right? And they've had a great tradition of defensive line play. Zach Harrison was, although Haskell Garrett had a little more production the year before, Zach Harrison was the headliner last year, right? Like you went into the season, especially in NFL draft circles, you're like, this is the year, right? Zach Harrison is going to take that massive step, because that's just what has kind of been the trend at Ohio State. Like, oh, he's a junior now. He's going to, he's played a little bit the first couple years, but now he's going to flip the script and he's going to make a huge ascension. And then the other fact of the matter is, Jay, is that this kid looks like he was built in a lab. I mean, let's call it what it is. There was a reason that he was a former 5-star recruit. He is verified at 266 pounds, 6'6", 35 and 3/4 inch arms, almost 36 inch arms. He's a 7'3" wingspan, right? Like this kid also in high school ran like a 10.9 in the 100-meter, right?
Yeah,
like he's just
something stupid, bro.
It's so at 6'6", 270 pounds, he's going to run the 4.5s probably. And so like that's a freaking nature. Like those guys don't come around that often. That's even more freaky than like a Chase Young, for instance, right? Like Chase Young was a great football player, but like Zach Harrison, just as a pure athlete, probably more impressive from a height, weight, speed conversation, right? So when you couple all those things together, you're like, wow, with Larry Johnson, that dude's going to be a dog, right? Like he's going to be the guy. And he wasn't. Like he was a very underwhelming football player last year. So the expectations were set so high that even if he was a good football player, you still would have been a little disappointed. But the fact of the matter is he was just a very average football player for Ohio State last year. And that gives you very concerned because the traits are so high. And Jay, I mean, he's going to be a fourth-year player, and he's still not even 21 years old. So, like, he's still young. So there's still time. But now you're getting into the point where it's now or never for Zach Harrison, not because he's getting too old or that he is exhausting eligibility. The fact of the matter is that you have guys behind you right now in Jack Sawyer and JT and all those dudes where if you have a bad beginning of the season and those guys kind of take those reps, then you're out of the rotation as an older guy, right? Like you start to lose your steam as a player. So this is a make it or break it year for Zach Harrison. And for all the physical traits he has that are well publicized, he wasn't that caliber of player last year for Ohio State.
No, he wasn't. I want to look at the stats very quickly. I know stats aren't the end-all be-all about how a player plays, but a lot of people that are watching this and getting ready for the season, especially on YouTube, people will look at, okay, well, I don't remember exactly how he plays specifically, best game, worst game, game in between, things like that. So let me go to the stat sheet to see what happened. Well, last year, Ryan, 25 total tackles. He had 6 tackles for loss, only 2 sacks, 3 pass breakups, and 1 forced fumble. The one alarming thing to me, he had as many sacks last year as he did in a shortened year in 2020. And I understand, like, in college, one thing I don't like about college football is they don't do all the stats and keep tally of all the stats like the NFL does, where quarterback curries and other things there that the NFL gives you all these stats. College is like, we'll give you just a little snapshot. We won't give you everything. Just a quick snapshot about what happened during the game. I don't really care. I care about the sacks to a little bit, but he's not even getting the pressure that you want a defensive end of his caliber, of someone that you think his caliber would be to get while at Ohio State. And that's the biggest thing, to where the pressure, the QB pressure, QB hurries that you expect him to get, being someone that you would think will take the next step, those things aren't happening.
Yeah, no, I mean, they're not. And it's really frustrating because, I mean, I talked about the build and the explosiveness and all that good stuff, right? There's just seems to be a lack of flexibility with him. Like he's a very linear football player. And for whatever reason, he can't bend the track. And then he doesn't really have hand nuance, right? Like he doesn't have moves in the arsenal. He's really just a speed to power converter. And like, that's fine. But speed to power converters also need secondary moves in order to create that pressure. So, I mean, Jay, he is one of the more frustrating watches I've had this offseason. I'll be very honest, because then you see him at times where it's like in the open field and he's just working in pursuit, and you're like, oh my God, look how he moves. Like, it's just incredible to kind of see him work in a straight line. But unfortunately, the game is not a fully linear game, right? Like you're not going to get an open rush. You're not going to get an open lane to the passer all the time unless you're working off like a stunt occasionally, right? Like you need to have some nuance in your hands, to your body movements, to your bend and your flexion in the ankles. And right now I just don't see that much with Zach Harrison. So he's a big wild card going into the year, because I mean, you could tell me that he puts it all together and he's a first round pick. You could tell me that, or you could tell me that he's a late day 3 pick, because that's just kind of the caliber that the kind of the tape that he's put out there right now. So very frustrating player to watch right now. Very frustrating.
If the draft was tomorrow, where do you think he would fall in the draft?
I think that someone. So look, his tape right now is late day 3, right? Like he's a 6th to 7th round player, because the positives is that he is a good run defender, right? Like he can set a firm edge. He has that long lockout ability. Like there's some good stuff to him, and he has powerful hands. He just doesn't have any nuance in him right now. So there's still a path for Zach Harrison to get drafted. Like I think he's a 6th to 7th round player on film right now. But the fact of the matter is he's going to blow up the combine, and someone's going to draft him probably in the 3rd or 4th round. Like I have no doubt in my mind that someone is going to look at him and say, I could fix that. I can make that work, right? Because NFL teams do it every single year. They go nuts for traits. And right now in summer scouting, I go nuts for traits too. But at the end of the day, when the final whistle blows, when you have that final evaluation, you need a guy to tangibly be a good football player, right? Like you need that. So he's going to get overdrafted, in my opinion. I wouldn't be shocked if he sneaks into late day 2 when it's all said and done. I wouldn't be shocked if he's an early day 3 type of football player. Is he a 3rd or 4th round player on tape right now? Absolutely not. But the fact of the matter is that he has traits and people are going to fall in love with it.
So let's go a little bit in looking into the end of the season. Kind of project, if you could, kind of do 2 things in one answer. Kind of project, if you could, what you think we'll see from Harrison and where he'll fall in the draft in the spring of next year.
Well, I hope he takes it to the next level, man. I really do, because he's a talented football player, and I personally want to also bet on those traits. So even if he just becomes a solid football player and he's able to finish more plays, and let's say he gets 6 to 7 sacks, maybe 10 tackles for loss, and you start to see it, then I think someone's going to draft him on day 2 firmly. Like, it's not going to be maybe 3rd round. Like, someone will draft him in the top 100 picks just based on that talent and having a little bit of production, right? So I think that there's 3 ways that could happen here, Jay, in my opinion. One, it's the most unfortunate thing, is that he gets drafted somewhere on day 3 because he just completely gets passed over by guys like JT and Jack Sawyer. Like, those guys just take his snaps, and he's just an athlete that you're going to try to take a gamble on somewhere on day 3. Number 2 is that he puts it partway together. He puts it partway together. I think he's firmly in day 2, even though some of those guys that put it partway together are still day 3 players, but his talent is to the level where you're also going to take a gamble on that. And then number 3 is that he puts it all the way together. Very unlikely, but he puts it all the way together. I mean, he's a 1st round level athlete. There's no doubt, but I'll say right now, I think that he puts it partway together. I would say 6 to 7 sacks, somewhere in that ballpark. He's more disruptive. Not a great player, but a good football player. And then he takes that ascension, obviously, at the combine or the pro day or whatever, what might have you. And I say that he becomes a top 100 player when it's all said and done, but that is certainly not what he is right now.
Ryan, let's have a little fun.
Okay.
I know it's not September 3rd. I know it's not tomorrow. But I'm curious what Notre Dame fans think about Zach Harrison as they're getting ready to play. Irish and Buckeyes are getting ready to play in week 1 of the upcoming season.
Yeah, I think that they expect him to be better, right? Okay. Like I don't think that they expect that it's going to be, because if you're just watching the film, you're just kind of saying, okay, Notre Dame has 2 good young offensive tackles and Joe Alt and Blake Fisher, both going into their sophomore year, extremely talented duo. And if you're basing it just on the film, you would say, I like our advantage. And I think that the coaches are going to look at the film and say, like, I think that Notre Dame has an advantage offensive tackle versus the defensive ends of Ohio State. But as a coach, you have to look at them and you have to look at Zach Harrison and say, but what if he put it together this offseason, right? You need to prepare for the absolute worst that you might see, or the best of what your opponent might be able to establish, right? So I think Notre Dame is preparing like Zach Harrison is going to hit that 5-star upside, because that's what that's the iron sharpens iron thing, right? Like, I don't think Blake Fisher, Joe Walt, and Harry Heastan as their offensive line coach is looking at him and saying, like, we don't need to worry about that guy. Like, they're preparing like they're seeing the best version of Zach Harrison. So I think that they're expecting that he's going to take a huge step this offseason.
There are a couple more guys on our list here that are draft-eligible players. We spent a lot of time on Harrison on purpose. Could have honestly gone longer. But I want to give a few minutes to each player here to let Ryan describe what he has seen when watching Jerron Cage and Taron Vincent. Before going there, could you kind of just assess solely and specifically the interior of the D-line last year and what either surprised you, wowed you, made you happy, or disappointed while watching them?
Well, I mean, what made me happy and excited as far as like an NFL draft analysis goes, Tyleik Williams is going to be a dude next year. Like him and hopefully Jack Sawyer. Obviously, I know he didn't play too much last year and he's kind of taken a huge step forward. And JT, I mean, the sophomore defensive class is exciting for Ohio State. It really is. So I'm excited to see Tyleik Williams, because I mean, he did have some production, right? Like, you don't usually get those guys that are going to be those interior pass rushers that are going to take a huge production points as a freshman. And he did. And he's only 19 years old. I mean, he was born in 2003, and you saw extreme flashes. And I know we talked a little bit before we started. It sounds like he even cut some weight this offseason. He looks like he's in the best shape of his life. And there's exciting traits there at 6'3", 315 pounds with the pressures. I mean, I think he had 20 plus pressures and like 5-ish sacks, somewhere in that ballpark. So a lot of exciting parts there. As excited as I am for Tyleik Williams, though, is how underwhelmed I am with the rest of the interior, to be honest. I mean, I know we wanted to talk. Taron Vincent was a guy where when he came out of IMG Academy, he was a dude, man. Like, he was supposed to be a 5-star caliber player. And, I mean, you kind of just look at his traits, and, I mean, he's 6'1", 289 pounds when he weighed in the spring with sub 32-inch arms. So I think he just lacks the traits, to be honest. Like, and he's going to be 23 years old when the draft does happen next April. So I don't see a huge outcome for him, to be honest, Jay. Like, I think he could be a solid college player, and I think that he'd be solid in the rotation, but I just don't see NFL player with Taron Vincent unless he takes like this massive step, because I don't think his traits are great, right? He's an undersized defensive lineman, doesn't have incredible quickness. He's got solid enough quickness, not the biggest guy in the world, obviously, with sub 32-inch arms as well. So everything's just kind of reduced and compact for him. So not really excited about him. I would say Jerron Cage, I'd like a little bit more. Again, not a guy that I think is going to get drafted or anything, but I think he could be a camp body and maybe take a role if he takes a nice step forward, because he's a guy that actually, remember, his brother actually played at Notre Dame, Daniel Cage, and I was excited about Jerron Cage coming out of high school. I wanted Notre Dame to kind of pick him up, but unfortunately he goes to Ohio State, and I mean, he's 6'2", 306. He's not the biggest kid in the world, but he's got 32-plus-inch arms. I've seen a little bit more on film comparative to Taron Vincent. Taron Vincent's just very, very inconsistent right now. I think that he might be a little more quick than like a Jerron Cage, but I think Jerron Cage is just a lot more consistent. So I don't think either one of those kids are going to be drafted. I think I like Cage a little bit more than Vincent right now, but I think the future of the Ohio State interior defensive line is going to be very good, because you got a guy like a Tyleik Williams who, if he puts it all together, man, it has a step up from last season. That from a projection perspective, he could be a dude this time next year. So I am excited about Tyleik Williams, and hopefully the cast of seniors just gives you enough on the interior defensive line for Ohio State.
So I recently listened to your podcast, Ryan. Say your podcast. Mm-hmm. You're not the only guy on there, but
it's my podcast. It's my podcast.
It is your podcast. And you guys, you and Joe, were discussing different numbers. I think Alex was on there. I think this was the time Alex was on there, made an appearance, hopped in, hopped out kind of thing. Yep. But you guys are talking about defensive line numbers. And if my memory is working very well, which is not the best thing at times, but I do believe Taron Vincent is number 6. Jerron Cage is number 86. Different. A receiver number for one, a single-digit number for the other. I don't mind it. I like I like the differences, variety, and I do like how they're not just going with the normal numbers for D linemen. I like the 6, the single-digit D tackles, the bigger, shorter, stumpier, big guys that are wearing those single-digit numbers. It's not normal, but I absolutely love it. Give me a single-digit guy as a D lineman, D tackle primarily. Give me that number versus the 86 receivers. Leave that for the receivers. Give me a single-digit number for a big guy all day, every day.
I don't disagree, man. And I fought back against Joe DeLeon on our podcast because he said that he doesn't really like the single digits, if I remember correctly. I'm just like, seriously? Like, how could you not like a big man in a single digit? I think it is a great aesthetic, to be honest. So Taron Vincent's got that working for him, man. The 6 looks nice. 86, it's all right. I mean, we talked a little bit about Jalen Carter, obviously. He wears number 88, and it's a little bit different. And I don't think Jerron Cage has a background as far as being a tight end or anything like that, right? So like 86 is a little bit funky. So I am a huge fan though of defensive linemen that wear the single digits, like George Karlaftis wearing 5, and I remember Lewis Nix wore number 1 back in the day for Notre Dame. Like the single digit numbers, Chase Young wearing number 2, like those. That looks nice. It's very aesthetically pleasing, but I agree with you. I don't think a defensive lineman in the 80s is very appealing personally.
Think about that, though. Lewis Nix wearing number 1. Nobody number 1 slims you down, but he kind of stretched that bad boy all the way out.
He sure did, man. He sure did. It's I told Joe, I think that I think that for it to look really nice, you still need a little bit of like roundness to the number, right? Like number 6, it's a little wide, so it doesn't look odd, right? Like number 1, it's just like everything is just like, that looks a little too like you're trying to condense everything, right? So you need a little bit of variety to the numbers. So like number 8's cool, number 6 is cool. Like I can get down with that, but number 1, 7's a little 9's a little but yeah, you need a little bit of roundness to the number to make it look right on the big guys, I think.
Ryan, I'm glad you're back with us. It's always fun chopping it up with you. For those of you listening and you enjoy Ryan or you're curious about what he thinks about other players on the defense, he'll literally be back on the show tomorrow talking about Ohio State's draft-eligible linebackers, Steel Chambers, Tommy Eichenberg, and Cody Simon. Ryan, if you could let everyone know where they can follow you on Twitter, follow the stuff you're doing with Rise and Draft Scouting, Irish Breakdown Recruiting as well, and the podcast that you host. It's yours, but your name is not on the title.
Love it, man. Love it. Well, Jay, first and foremost, man, I appreciate you as always. If you want any NFL draft content, Rise and Draft on Twitter is where you can find me, and it's also riseanddraft.com, where if you want anything from prospect database, mock draft simulator, scouting reports, all that good stuff, it's kind of a one-stop shop for draft nerds like myself. So take a look over there. You can also find on the site our podcast, which is the Believe in NFL Draft Prospect podcast, where we do a lot of player interviews, and also we're deep into summer scouting. We're going to be taking on linebackers this week. So make sure to take a look there. And then, of course, Ohio State's playing Notre Dame, first game of the year in the Horseshoe. So if you would like to get a little insight into what Notre Dame has planned and what Notre Dame has cooking as far as like an opponent preview, you can go over to irishbreakdown.com and just check out anything that you need as far as the Notre Dame scope of everything.
And guys, you can follow me on Twitter at jstevens07. Send all of your emails to jstevens317 at gmail.com. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Buckeyes on your favorite audio podcast listening app, or even on YouTube as well. Subscribe, like the video on YouTube, leave a comment, a 2 or 3. If you dislike something Ryan said, leave a comment. I might take a screenshot, send it to Ryan so he can read what you have to say, just because I know we're going to have fun with that as well. Ryan will be back tomorrow. I'll be back tomorrow discussing Ohio State's draft-eligible linebackers and what a scout has to say about them. We're out of here on this Wednesday. Have a great day.